Hello and welcome to episode 50 of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill. Well, here we are at number 50, half a century. It's taken a while to get here. I don't know whether it's longer than I expected, probably a bit, but there we are. There's been a lot to talk about and a lot of travelling that William's done to discuss over that time. So I have at least kept going and persisted doing it despite other circumstances sometimes getting in the way. If you're tuning in for the first time, well done. 50 is a good point to jump in, I suppose. There's plenty of episodes to listen to previously to this. At the moment, we're with William in Mexico, but before that, there's a whole journey that he undertook through Europe, travelling to Milan to be an engineer and train driver at one of the very, very earliest railways in Italy, in Milan. So there's that whole bit, which I think takes you up to about episode 39, something like that. And then his journey across the Atlantic to Mexico. But by this time, we're in Mexico, we're in Zacatecas, where he eventually ends up working as a engineer, introducing basically steam technology into the mines, the silver mines of Mexico, and also into the mint, the coin making process. It's a fairly antiquated way of producing the coins at this time in Mexico, and so William's role really is to introduce steam power and mechanisation into it to make it more efficient, and that's his role and profession and expertise that he brings to this particular project. If you're tuning in again, thanks very much for doing so. I'm glad you are. Well done, everybody. I hope you're enjoying it. You can binge listen, you can listen when each episode arrives, which is roughly about every month. That usually takes me about a month, what with other things going on, to record and edit the episodes. So thanks very much for your continued listening, and by all means, I hope you're enjoying it, and do tell your friends, do subscribe, do shout from the rooftops about the podcast and how brilliant and fantastic it is, and how incredibly enlightening it is, and how it can help you get off to sleep if you're having a particularly rough night. Which even myself listening to it on occasion has happened. They do say you can never get tired of listening to your own voice, but I can assure you it can get you to the point of drowsiness where you'll happily nod off. But I hope it's more engaging than that most of the time. I mean, you don't have to listen to an episode all in one go. You can listen to half an hour and another half an hour later on, or 10 minutes. Or you can, I've realised, you can speed it up ever so slightly by a degree or two and listen to it a bit quicker that way. It's only a couple of notches up. If you go too far, I end up sounding like one of the chipmunks. But I have noticed you notch it up a couple and it doesn't really make that much difference to the listening experience, but it brings it in about 5 minutes shorter. So if you're desperate to save that 5 minutes in your podcast listening, why not do that? Anyway, I usually begin each episode by explaining where we were at the end of the last one and what's going to happen in the next one. Now, at the end of the last episode, William was still recovering really from this rather unfortunate accident that he'd happened that had caused a serious injury to his, shall we say, lower regions of his body. I think we're talking basically about his bottom or his posterior. He'd wrenched something stepping down into a pit involved in where the mint was, and he'd fallen badly, and he's unfortunately sort of ripped his arse, I suppose. So I can only say, or his bottom, and created a wound, and this became a fistula, a thing that's known as a fistula that had expanded and swelled considerably, causing him a lot of pain and a lot of grief, and he was confined to his bed for about 4 weeks. Now, at the end of the last episode, he's still getting over that. He must have got over it enough to be able to, unfortunately, beat one of his poor servant boys who'd stolen some money from him. So he still obviously had enough energy to literally crack the whip on some poor boy's hide or back or whatever and dismissed him. He's not coming over as a terribly attractive character, is he? Anyway, but maybe he wasn't in a good mood, I would think, given the situation around his bottom. I mean, there's a reason people are often negatively referred to as a pain in the arse. Anyway, that's where William was. And at the beginning of this episode, 50, he then decides to just say a little bit more about Zacatecas and where he is and what he's learned of it so far, and outline his situation and his circumstances. And it's quite a good episode. I think there's some sort of interesting things there. He is beginning to observe some of the daily life in Zacatecas when he's not working, particularly some of the religious ceremonies that go on in what was a profoundly Roman Catholic country at the time, perhaps in terms of ceremonies more so than Italy, where he'd been living previously. So I think that is creating quite an impression on him as well. So I hope you enjoy it. As ever, if you do want to make contact with me, and I really do appreciate it when people do, and it's great to get some engagement from people, you can visit the X or Twitter account devoted to the podcast, which is Scott of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour. That's the number 3. I usually post things when each episode goes up there, and you can always message me there. There's a Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great Grandad, and there's a Blue Sky account as well, and that is Scott's Grand Tour at bsky.social. So those are all ways in which you can contact me and, pick me up on something that I might have got wrong historically, or if you've got any observations or expertise about a particular thing I've been talking about or William has experienced and you know more about it, do let me know. It's really, really, really good to get a dialogue going. Previously, I've had fantastic conversations with a chap called David Roberts, who actually lives in Milan now, or lives in Monza actually, but has walked the route of the train journey that William used to drive the train on from Monza to Milan, and has written a blog about it as well. So those sort of things are fantastic. You don't have to go to that extent. You can just say whether you like or don't like the podcast, but it's always good to hear any comments that anyone has. Anyway, let's get on with episode 50. It begins, as I say, with William beginning to say and describe a little bit about Zacatecas itself. May 11th. It is now time that I should say something respecting the city of Zacatecas, where I've been residing for more than 4 months, but what with sickness and an excess of business, I have had no time to look around me yet, and can only give a few general ideas. The city of Zacatecas is the capital of the department of that name, and is romantically situated in a valley of the Cordilleras. It has long been famous for the richness of the silver mines in its vicinity, and which has yielded since the foundation of the city about 300 years ago the enormous quantity of 90 million of marks, equivalent to $750 million. So the mark in ancient times, obviously you had the German mark, but it's equivalent to about 250 grams in weight. 90 million of marks, equivalent to $750 million. This is the amount upon which duty has been paid to the government, and there is not at least double that at the first working of the mines. Furthermore, during the troubles occasioned by the Revolution, a quantity equal to 1/2 of this amount was stolen and smuggled, without the authorities being able to get any account of it. Zacatecas was much celebrated for its riches, opulence, and industry, previous to the troubles of 1832-33, when a battle was fought between the army of Santa Anna and the Zacatecans, when the former was victorious through the treachery of some other commanders. Several of the principal citizens were shot in the plaza of the village of Guadalupe, and the city pillaged by the soldiers. Zacatecas is entirely surrounded by mountains, the only level entrance being that of Guadalupe, through a narrow valley, and the first right of the city from that road which has been formed at a vast expense is very good. Zacatecas contains a cathedral, 7 churches, 8 chapels, 5 convents, and 2 colleges, which, if I am spared with health, it is my intention to visit and describe in detail. The departmental palace, which occupies one side of the plaza of the same name, is a large and substantial building and well fitted up in the interior. Directly opposite to it is a large edifice containing the Tribunal Superior, the Tribunal of Commerce, the Public Library, and the Government Printing Office. The Casa de la Caja, or Custom House, is a large and commodious building, and splendidly decorated on its exterior in the arabesque style of architecture. The Casa de Moneda, or Mint, built in 1811, is a most noble edifice, occupying the frontage of 310 feet in length by 290 in depth. Within its walls are residences of the director and others of the principal officers, exclusive of the buildings occupied by the coining department. The machinery is worked by mules, and the quantity kept for the purpose exceeds 40. The machinery consists of 6 pair of breaking down and finishing rollers, 6 cutting-out presses, 4 cording or milling machines, and 5 coining presses. The quantity of money coined averages $100,000 per week, or $5 million per annum. The silver coinage of Mexico consists of dollars, value in English money 4 shillings, half dollars, or pesos, quarter dollars, reals, the eighth part of a dollar, medallos, or half reals, quarterillos, or quarter reals. The gold coinage are ounces, or doubloons, $16, or £3 4 shillings English. The copper coinage consists only of quartillos and tiacos, the former 3 halfpence, and the latter 3 farthings English. The quantity of money coined from the establishment of the mint in 1811 to the close of 1842 amounted to $105 millions. Okay, I'm going to break in here. It's quite early on in this part of the journal, but I just thought in terms of what happens later, it was a good point to interject. I just thought I'd expand a bit more on what William's talking about when he mentions the history of Zacatecas and its battle against Santa Anna at this time, because it was only a few years before William's there, because it happened in 1835. And as I've often said, Mexico really was at a time of quite turbulent conditions politically, particularly with the rule of Santa Anna, or should I say, to give him his full title, Antonio López de Santa Anna. As I've mentioned before, he was a very dominant figure in Mexican politics at this time. He was a sort of Mexican equivalent of Bismarck, or not as grand a scale Napoleon. But anyway, he essentially became the dictator of Mexico at this time. And that was partly because, and this was why this uprising in Zacatecas happened, was when he first came to power, he was a believer in Mexico being run in a kind of federal way, rather like the American states to the north of Mexico when it won its independence from Spain. But his position changed over the years, and he became more and more a centralist figure. And essentially, he got rid of the federal constitution as it had been set up in 1824 and started to rule Mexico more centrally. And Zacatecas at this time, probably partly because of its wealth, due to its links to the silver mining industry, was one of the bigger and more powerful states of Mexico. And so they objected to Santa Anna's move to this more centralist way of governing Mexico. They rejected it, and they had quite a powerful local militia and army of their own. It was led by the state governor, Francisco Garcia Salinas, and basically they mobilized their troops and militia to fight the Mexican military. And what happened was that Santa Anna saw this as a real threat to his authority, and so with the Mexican army, he basically very, very severely crushed this rebellion. Although the numbers of soldiers on each side and militia were equivalent in numbers, the Mexican army was much better armed and, I imagine, better organised as well, and so they fairly roundly defeated this Zacatecan mob, I suppose, or Zacatecan army or militia. And then Santa Anna instructed that his soldiers loot the city of Zacatecas as well. So he, by doing this, obviously created a great feeling of resentment in Zacatecas. Another thing that he did was he kind of effectively reduced the size of Zacatecas as well. He took a large chunk of it and created the other state, the new state called Aguascalientes, which was the one William travelled through on his journey up to Zacatecas. So he essentially created that state as a way of weakening Zacatecas in terms of its actual borders and territory by creating another new state to the south of it, which essentially was a chunk of it which would be loyal to him. Now, apparently, in historical terms, this was quite an important move because to the north of Zacatecas, quite a lot further north, but to the north was Texas. And Texas, like Zacatecas in a way, as a state of Mexico, at that time was in a way even more anti-centralist government because its composition of its settlers was a mixture of not only Mexicans but also white Anglo-Saxons and other people emigrating from Europe to America. So its tendency to be more independent was stronger anyway. And of course, when they saw what had happened in Zacatecas and how brutally Santa Anna had treated the Zacatecans and the leaders of the uprising, because he had several of them shot and so forth, that, obviously that created an even greater feeling of Texas wanting to depart and move away or become independent from Mexico. The other thing I thought I'd mention here is the money that William talks about and the mint, the Casa de Moneda. I should perhaps explain a few things about Mexican money at this time. Now, William gives a description of all the various coins that make up the Mexican currency. I mean, the Mexican currency was known as the real, but an important part of it was the 8 real or the silver dollar, also known colloquially around the world as a piece of 8 or pieces of 8. And basically, the silver dollar at that time, the Mexican silver dollar, was really a global currency. And the reason for this was apparently because the weight of the Mexican dollar and the purity of the silver was very consistent. So at this time, money was literally worth its weight in gold, stroke silver, whatever it was. And so the mint in Zacatecas was very important because also another rule was that silver from Mexico could only officially be exported as coins. So it couldn't be exported as bullion or, lumps of silver. It had to be coined first and then exported. And so actually the Zacatecas mint was very important because it was producing, as William says, quite an enormous amount of coins, even though at that time its manufacturing technology was pretty basic with mules and so forth. And that's why William was there to actually increase production by introducing steam technology. So as I say, actually dating back quite a long way before William's time, so this is also part of the Spanish Empire and its rule around the globe as well. The piece of 8 or Mexican silver dollar was widely recognised not only in Mexico but in the US. Essentially it was valued the same as the US dollar. In fact, the US dollar later was actually modelled on the Mexican dollar in terms of its size and weight and value. It was widely used in China, in Asia, obviously in Spain and its colonies around the world. And it was a global currency, so that's why pirates and so forth liked capturing it. And even into the 19th century, it was still highly valued. And at this time, although it's coming to the end of its value in the world, in the 1840s, it was still worth a lot and still worth global currency and still an important way Mexico had of carrying out its trade and building on its wealth around the world. So interestingly, even I think it's up until 1857, the Mexican dollar was still legal tender in America, in the USA, and it was still legal tender in many other places or accepted much in the same way as the US dollar is accepted around the world as an alternative currency these days. Now, eventually, its value diminished because, you could say primarily because Britain adopted what they call the gold standard. And again, the currency was worth its weight in gold, or you could literally store gold in vaults. And that's why, mainly because gold's rarity was greater than silver. In a way, the success of mining in Mexico undermined the value of the silver dollar, because more and more mines were discovered, not only in Mexico but around the world, also in places like America and other places, and it could be more easily produced, and it started to be used even more in things like domestic products like cutlery and so forth. So the value of silver and its rarity diminished, but of course gold's rarity stayed the same. So you could literally have gold in the vaults of the Bank of England at that time, and you could use a banknote to equivalently be worth its weight in gold. And because Britain had adopted the gold standard and was the biggest trading nation in the world at that time, on an empire on which the sun never set, then you could essentially, because of Britain's power in trade terms, that essentially meant other countries around the world had to adopt it too. And so Germany did, France did, and even America did eventually. So that basically was what led to the eventual diminishing of the real or Mexican dollar or piece of eight in its worth and trading usefulness. And the reason it's called a piece of eight, or known as a nickname of pieces of eight, was because it was an eighth part of a real. So the real was I suppose, like you'd say, sterling is the currency of the UK. The real was the currency of Mexico, and a piece of eight was an eighth piece part of a real. And as I said, the US dollar was modelled on the Mexican dollar. There's an act of American Parliament, or whatever you wanted to call it, where they deliberately say we are going to copy the US dollar in terms of its size and its weight and its purity of its silver. William makes a bit of a non sequitur jump here. The large and handsome theatre in the city was erected a few years ago, and previous to the erection of the new one in the city of Mexico was the handsomest in the whole republic. The Plaza de la Constitution is situated nearly in the centre of the city, and is a tolerably large square, having a lofty obelisk in the middle, 4 fountains being placed at the corners. At the upper end of the plaza the cathedral is situated. The Plaza de Villarreal is a large noble square, surrounded by trees and a handsome fountain in the centre. One side of this plaza is an immensely large building, which at one period has been an exceedingly handsome edifice under the Spanish government. It was the palace of the intendant of the mines, but since the Revolution it has been converted into the diligence office and an hotel. On the west side of this plaza is the College de Ginas, containing several handsome apartments and a neat church. This college is for the education of the priesthood solely. Opposite this, and on the eastern side of the plaza, is the tobacco manufactory, a government affair throughout the whole of the Republic. This building is yet unfinished. It is in the Ionic style of architecture, and when finished will be a great ornament to that part of the city. The Plaza of San Juan de Dios is in front of the church, and the convent of that name has recently been planted with trees, and they are now erecting a very pretty fountain in the centre of it. And then we get another one of William's poems. Now from the city let us haste away, and in the Almeida's grove a moment stray. Quick sinks the sun, the closing hour of day comes onward mantled o'er the sober grey. See here, fair Flora holds her gilded reign, her choicest beauty spread along the plain. The blooming daffodil, the fragrant rose, the modest violet, and the pink disclose all of their rich beauties, and the wallflower gay, with stately dahlia in its bright array. Here once was barren waste and tangled thorn, now lofty pine and curious plants adorn. To leafless shrubs the flowery palm succeeds, and scented myrtle to the noisome weeds. The verdant orange lifts its beauteous head, on every bough of the golden fruit is spread. With odours sweet it fills the smiling place, in all the native dignity of grace. Here spread thy purple clusters, tempting vine, and thou more tempting still bright beauty shine. Shine all in all your charms together rise, that all in all your charms you may surprise. There is a place where I could linger still, the setting sun had sunk beneath yon hill, but to your charms we now must bid adieu, again when evening comes, I will visit you. And back to the journal again. The Almeida, or public garden of Zacatecas, is indeed a beautiful spot, surrounded as the city is by lofty and barren mountains. It is like finding an oasis in the desert, to alight upon its shady walks and blooming parterres. It is situated in a valley directly outside the city and has been formed at vast expense. The substratum being nothing but barren rock, the earth had to be brought in from a considerable distance. There are 4 avenues for walks, the outside ones for carriages and equestrians, and the inner ones for the pedestrians. Large and lofty trees have been planted to give the requisite shade, and the borders, which are very neatly kept, are filled with roses, myrtle, oranges, and vast varieties of other unknown plants in Europe. There are 2 handsome fountains placed at regular distances from the extremities, and from there little rills are conducted to all parts of the garden during the dry season. For an hour previous to sunset, the Almeida swarms with people both on horseback and on foot, some for the benefit of the air, the young beauties to show their pretty faces, and in this city they are not few in number, and the handsomest women in the Republic, the young bucks to show themselves and their horses, most of the ladies, who are foreigners, showing themselves also on horseback. The scene is very animating, and there is no other place in Zacatecas where I can enjoy myself so much. But the shades of the evening are surrounding me, the sun has set behind the Grillo mountain, and I must close, for it is what we call Saturday night. May 12th, Sunday. Another beautiful morning has dawned upon us, similar to what we have had for many weeks, and I am longing to be out and enjoying myself in the open air. But though I am recovering fast and able to go down to the Mint, my doctor will not allow me to move more than I can help, and absolutely insists upon my making Sunday a perfect rest day. And as the wound has not yet healed, so I am obliged to comply. Well, I will amuse myself by giving a description of my residence. The Casa del Cobre was erected by the departmental government in the year 1840, for the purpose of smelting the ores of copper, which are procured from several mines in the department of Zacatecas. But for some reasons, with which I am unacquainted, the mines are not at present worked. These premises are very extensive and cover a large space of ground in the very highest part of the city. They consist of a large and handsome dwelling house, part of which I occupy, several smaller dwellings in which reside a number of persons employed in the mint. Behind the principal dwelling house are 3 large smelting furnaces and the small brass foundry. In an adjoining courtyard is the large brass foundry with 4 air furnaces, and then there is a large square patio where the ores are trodden by mules. Then a building in which there is the crushing and washing apparatus, and above it the spacious stables or corrals where the horses and mules are kept. The room which I at present occupy is about 15 feet square, lofty and very light, with a large window and projecting balcony. In one corner stands my bed. The bedstead I can take to pieces in 5 minutes, fold up, and place the whole on the back of a mule if required. Alongside of the bed stands a washing table and its requisites. Above it is my looking-glass, a large map, 2 brace of pistols, and a broadsword. Now, I did a bit of research in this. I think this is probably a sword that Mexicans would have called an espada ancha, or wide sword. In the wall opposite the window are 2 large closets, one of which contains my wearing apparel and linen. The other would puzzle an auctioneer to give a catalogue of its contents: pistol holsters, boots and shoes, doctor's bottles and gallipots. So that's a small pot for medicines. Baskets and brushes, bundles of letters and ends of cigars, cups and saucers and old rags comprise some of the items of this curious museum. Betwixt the 2 is placed a sideboard, and above it a range of shelves, on which is placed my books, some rare and beautiful shells, specimens of ores and minerals, and on the sideboard itself my portable desk, dressing, and instrument case. Behind the door on a frame for the purpose is my saddle, bridle spurs, and a whip, ready for equestrian excursions. Right, I'm going to stop again here to say a little bit more about William's description of Zacatecas. Firstly, I just thought I'd comment on his poem about the Alameda, the garden. I think it's actually one of his best poems that he writes in the journals. And I really think it's a nice, evocative picture of this park in the dimming evening light. So well done for well done to Will for that. I think earlier on in the journals, when he writes a poem about the cemetery Père Lachaise in Paris, that's actually another good poem as well. So he manages to put some nice words together here. I will just say that the Alameda, it's still there today. It's a very historical park in Zacatecas, but it's not really, in terms of shape, it's not really a park. It's more of a long walkway. So it's a linear park with these walkways, which I suppose was good for the people of the time to promenade around and show themselves in their best attire during the evening and riding their horses and that, and the young bucks riding around to impress the pretty ladies, as William mentions. And as he says, in this part of Mexico, they are not few in number. So obviously the women of Zacatecas have caught William's eye. Not the first and last time this will happen in the journals. The park's creation was ordered by Governor Francisco Garcia Salinas, who I think we mentioned earlier when he was in this political uprising with Santa Anna. But he actually, as a governor of Zacatecas, was I think you'd describe him as a benevolent character. In fact, his nickname, well, in English, it is Father Frankie. I think the Spanish is Tata Pachito. Basically, it's Father Frankie. So he was obviously a benevolent figure and quite a sort of liberal governor of early independent Mexico. And he very much was on the liberal side of making the country sort of republic that had federal governance. He was, in fact, finance minister at one time, early on in Mexico's independent government. But by this time, he was the governor of Zacatecas, where he'd been born. Anyway, he instructed the building of this park, the Alameda, or this walkway, which William seems to enjoy so much. And apparently it's still there, it's still well looked after. It's quite often used for community and cultural events in the city, so its importance has remained ever since William's time, really. I do like this description of his apartment that he gives in the Casa del Cobre. Now, I have looked this up, and there is a building called the Casa del Cobre. It looks rather run down. These days it's an art gallery, but it certainly looks the right era of the time. It's a bit hard to describe its location in terms of how William describes it, because so much obviously has changed in that time around it. So when he talks of the church of San Domingo being directly opposite it, it's a bit hard to tell if in William's time you could probably see that, but maybe now it would be hard to see, maybe from the upper floors. But it does certainly look like the right era of building, and as Will describes it, I certainly think it could well be where he stayed. But yeah, I do like this description that he gives around of his various things, like his wearing attire and his washing requisites and things like that. It's kind of a nice picture that he gives. And of course, one of the things that he does mention, which does give you a sense of Mexico being a much more lawless place compared to where he has been in Europe, is the fact that he's got not only these pistols hanging on the wall, but he's got this sword, which he calls a broadsword. Now, as I mentioned, I think this could be what would be called an espada anca. It's written espada anca, but I think in Spanish you would actually say it as espadanca. Anyway, it basically means broadsword. The direct English equivalent is broadsword. Now, these swords were a sword that developed in Mexico and South America during the Spanish times of conquest and occupation, and they evolved from being quite long swords into gradually getting shorter and shorter. And one of the reasons for this was that people often had to have them when they were on horseback. So having a great big long sword on a horse is a bit of a hard thing to handle. And so the sword gradually became shorter and shorter, but they were very, very widely used. And in fact, they sort of evolved, aside from just being a sword, they almost became like a machete in terms of being a useful knife to cut away scrub and bushes and things like that, but also, to chop anything you needed to chop, like a bit of fruit or vegetable or whatever as well, when you were on the road. So it sort of became a kind of a multi-purpose blade. and they were very widely used amongst the Mexican population at that time. I mean, they date back to the 17th century, but they did carry on till the 19th century. And they were usually about 18 to 30 inches long, so probably more like 18 inches. And the blade was usually about 2.5 inches wide. Some were quite fancy with fancy hilts, others were quite plain. And I'll just read a little bit here. It says, by the late 18th century, the espada ancha was often issued or carried by militia, rural constables, and even ranchers and travellers, which of course pretty well describes William as a traveller. Its form was gradually phased out with the rise of mass-produced sabres and machetes during the 19th century, but at that time, William would have had one. And its advantages, it's had excellent cutting power to the blade width, robust construction suited for rugged conditions, effective both as a weapon and utility blade. So, as I say, it was this multi-purpose sword, really, and simpler and cheaper to produce than European swords. If you look at pictures, as I say, there are quite fancy ones, but there are also quite basic-looking ones as well. But it is interesting to show that William looks like every time he went out on his horse, not only was he armed with pistols, but he was also armed with a big sword as well, or should I say, a small broadsword. So he certainly never had to carry anything like that when he was travelling around genteel Europe or the streets of old London town. So I suppose to him it would have felt quite a different way of having to travel, really, and be aware of the dangers. A bit of an early cowboy, really, which you will learn more about that relationship between Mexican horsemen and ranchers and the cowboy, because cowboys really evolved out of Mexican ranchers, despite what you might think from Hollywood films. But having described the interior, let us see what the exterior presents. Throw open the folding casements and advance to the balcony, and you have the whole city before you. Directly in front is the church and the convent of San Domingo. It's a lofty dome, and one of its graceful towers rising in bold relief against a clear blue sky. And a little to the right, and directly under the brow of the mountain of St. Andre, is the church and convent of San Juan de Dios. Now look straight betwixt the two, and in the distance you will perceive the plains of Guadalupe, the beautiful lakes that are scattered over the surface of them, sleeping like molten silver in the bright sunlight. Now take this glass, and you will perceive that their surfaces are swarming with wildfowl. See also those large tracts of wheat. Their whole golden colour tells you that they are ripe unto harvest. See how beautifully they contrast with those patches of maize clothed in vivid green. Lay aside the glass and turn your eyes to the left. Behold that lofty mountain rising to an elevation of 12,000 feet above the level of the sea. Look at those mighty rocks that crown its summit, one bearing a resemblance to the crest of a helmet, and the other broken into 1,000 fantastic shapes. Notice that the building betwixt the two is the Carmelite convent, with its beautiful white church, and even there, at that elevation, blooms and flourishes the palm tree. At this period of the year, the sun rises directly behind this mountain, which is called the Bufa, or La Bufa, and as I leave my inside shutters slightly open during the night, its shadow, at 5:30, glances through my window, and upon a large map of the United States and Mexico, which hangs opposite the foot of the bed, and tinges it with the most brilliant colours. And another William poem again. The rising sun, how glorious in the east, how fair the stretching clouds appear, oh, what a heavenly feast! A blaze of brightened glory gilds the landscape far and wide, and what a train of lovely thoughts the opening day betide. It tells of youth's gay buds of hope, who pain nor sorrow know, for all is yet bright happiness as on our path we go. It tells of mirth and pleasures too, in opening life so gay, of gladsome hours in which we share and happy pass each day. It tells of beauty's beaming charms, of fervent friendships too, of love, sweet love, triumphant love in hearts both firm and true. It tells of those sweet heavenly maids whose hearts we wish to gain, of all those dear and recent joys unsullied without stain. It tells that there is a world to come, yes, far above the skies, and if we tread in virtue's path, it is where we shall arise. Yet though a cloud pass over this life, and we sleep in the grave, we know that he who made the sun is mighty for to save. And then at the end of it, it says W.S., so that's Will. Alkborough, Lincolnshire, 1820. So obviously he just decided to insert one of his older poems here. But let us now return to the balcony and finish our survey of the city. The large building you see between the Buffa and San Domingo, with a circular tower at each corner and a lofty flagstaff on the top, is the citadel, once strongly fortified and commanding with the narrow pass of Guadalupe and the city as well. But Santa Anna, having changed the government of the Republic from that of independent states on the model of the United States to that of departments, immediately dependent on the central junta, stripped all the interior fortresses, and this of the Zacatecas, of course, amongst the rest. In line with the citadel, and about half the distance, is a large white building, its top ornamented with a number of pinnacles. That is the Casa del Moneda, or Mint. To the left of it rise the lofty, graceful, and richly ornamented towers of the cathedral. You can also see the upper part of its western front above the buildings, with its numerous ranges of statues. But the cathedral does not show well from this point, on account of it being backed by the mountains of the Buffa. To the extreme left is the church of San Augustine, its 3 domes covered with blue and white mosaics. The lofty square edifice adjoining it was once the convent, but is now converted into barracks. And now let us retire, for I think we have noticed everything worthy of our attention from this point. In describing the interior of my apartment, I omitted to notice that over the sideboard and bookshelves hangs the banner of Old England. So I don't know whether this is the St. George flag or the Union Jack, but here we are. Will writes a little ode to it. The flag that's braved 1,000 years, the battle and the breeze. Okay, time for me to step in again here just to say a few quick words about some of the references that Will has made. The first one I thought I'd discuss is this mountain called La Buffa, and this is the first time he mentions it, but you'll hear it referred to many times throughout the rest of the journals, because it's this very distinctive mountain that overlooks the city of Zacatecas. It's called La Buffa. I think that comes from a word meaning pig bladder. It's this curious mountain. On the top of it, there's this sort of ridge. It almost, to me, looks almost like a kind of, if you can imagine a huge woodlouse and it's sort of back with all the ridges on it, I would describe that as the shape, really. Anyway, that sort of sticks up from the top of the peak. So it gives it this very distinctive look. And I think actually now there's a cable car that runs from it down into the city as well. There's also a observatory up there as well. And it's quite a big tourist attraction for the city. But it is this distinctive shape and basically a very well-known landmark of Zacatecas. And in fact, the tribe, the Zacatecans, from which the city derives its name, were one of the tribes that lived there on this La Buffa peak. It also, after William's time, became quite a significant spot because there was a battle that happened there during the time of the Mexican Revolution in 1914, in which the dictator Victoriano was defeated here at this Battle of Zacatecas that happened in and around the mountain. And in fact, apparently you can still see the bullet holes from this battle and the observatory there. Next thing I thought I'd mention is this poem that William inserts that's obviously written 20 years before he's writing in the journals at Alkborough. I suppose this is one of the instances which he talks about earlier on where he says, I'm going to insert some of my older notes, I think he says, and older poetry into the journals. So he just throws it in there, really. It doesn't seem to have any particular relevance to anything that he'd been writing either before or after. But it's quite a nice poem for one of these sort of Mayday ones that he seems to write quite a lot of. And then there's his little couplet to the flag as well, the old flag of Britain. Flag that's braved 1,000 years, the battle and the breeze.
Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves.
I suppose that sums up what happens to a lot of flags, I suppose. Most of them have to put up with the breeze, don't they? And some have to put up with battles as well. And I suppose you could say that the Union Jack has. I think he must be talking about 1,000 years. I mean, the Union Jack hadn't existed for 1,000 years. So maybe he means the George Cross. I suppose it would be the George Cross. But he is a bit of a jingoistic bod sometimes, so maybe he just foregoes whether it's accurate as to whether the flags actually existed. Well, apparently, the Union Jack was finally completed in the form we know today in 1801, only about 40 years before William's writing, although earlier versions apparently date back to 1606, which I have seen those versions because you get the bits added later on, don't you, when Scotland joins the Union. Just reading here for my wife's benefit, the reason Wales isn't represented in the flag is because by 1606, when the first Union Jack was produced, Wales was already considered to be part of England because it had been annexed earlier on. So it wasn't considered a separate country in sort of political terms. I am quite surprised here that apparently the red dragon, that's the symbol that's well known on the Welsh flag today, didn't really start being used until the 1950s, and it was only officially recognised by the Queen in 1959. I mean, I'm sure as a heraldic image it goes back much further than that, but its use on a flag is much younger than I thought. The next thing I thought I'd just explain is that William refers to Santa Anna's junta, and that word is one that intrigued me a lot because you hear it used, and it's one of those things where you have a sort of vague, perhaps, or I personally have a sort of vague understanding of its meaning. I mean, literally, it just means a meeting in Spanish or a council. In the terms of how it was used by Santa Anna in Mexico at this time in 1841, he's this overarching figure in Mexican politics, but he'd overthrown President Anastasio Bustamante. I'm probably saying that wrong. And then to legitimise his dictatorship, he formed this junta, a council, and brought in basically his cronies. But in a way, this was to convey a sense to the rest of Mexico that he wasn't a dictator, that he had a council of people and it was a legitimate government. Of course, it wasn't really, because they were all his cronies. So it meant he didn't actually have to hold elections amongst the people. So it was, a sort of smart political move. So again, it just goes to show the turmoil that Mexico was in politically at this time, with various times when Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was manipulating things in and out of power, centralising power at times, pretending to distribute it. It was all part of his machinations, really, to rule Mexico. But unfortunately, it didn't really do the country in the long term any good, particularly when it came to the war against America. May 15th. The new governor of the Department of Zacatecas made his public entry into the city today at noon. A deputation of the principal inhabitants, accompanied by the military, went to the boundaries to meet him. He entered the Plaza de la Constitution amidst the firing of cannon, the ringing of bells, and cheers of the people. Most of the inhabitants on the route had flags suspended from their balconies, and in the evening the city was illuminated. May 16th. Ascension Day. A grand festival here. There is a small chapel on the side of the Grillo Mountain, to which there was a procession in the morning, which I call the bedquilt procession. For along several of the streets through which the procession passed, there was cords stretched across which the old women had suspended their bedquilts, counterpanes, so that's bedspreads, etc., and their counterpanes. And though it might appear all very grand to Zacatecans, to a European it was perfectly ludicrous. May 17th. Grand procession this evening, and the best of anything of the kind I have yet seen in the country. At the convent of Guadalupe there is a celebrated image of the Virgin, which a couple of centuries ago was reputed to have the power of working miracles. This image is about 3 feet in height and stands upon a pedestal of solid silver, the edges of the robe and the crown being of gold. The figure is also ornamented with valuable gems and precious stones. I was informed from a very good authority that the intrinsic value of the image was $200,000, or £40,000 English. Well, it is an annual custom that this image should be brought from Guadalupe on the day after the Feast of Ascension to the Cathedral of Zacatecas, there to remain for the space of 9 days, the removal taking place with great formality and state. At the boundaries of the city on the Guadalupe road, 3 triumphal arches was erected across the street, and under each one of these was erected an altar decorated with flowers and wax candles. A guard of soldiers proceeded to Guadalupe with an open carriage. In this the image of the Virgin is placed, and they return to Zacatecas amidst the firing of guns and rockets, etc. On arriving at the first altar, the image is taken from the carriage and placed in front of it. In the meantime, another part of the play has been in progress. Another procession has proceeded from the church of San Juan de Dios to meet the other. First was an angel the size of life, standing on a pedestal and borne on men's shoulders, clad in an exceedingly rich silk robe, a plume of ostrich feathers on the head, which was encircled by a gold band, luxuriant tresses, so that's locks of hair, falling on the shoulders. To the back was affixed a pair of large wings covered with real feathers, and then came another figure representing the Apostle Peter, in one hand of which was placed a long staff, and in the other the keys of the celestial regions. After this was another full-length figure, in crimson robe and a crown upon the head, meant to be Joseph, the husband of the Virgin. He held in his arms a figure representing the infant Jesus. The frame upon which both this figure and that of St. Peter stood was of large size, and representations of temples, churches, etc. were placed upon it, and decorated with flowers and small banners. Lighted wax candles were also placed around the edges, and about 20 men supported the last-mentioned figures, and they appeared to have quite work enough. These were followed by a long train of priests, crosses, and incense-bearers. Having reached the place where the image of the Virgin was placed, the procession was rearranged, and they proceeded to the church of San Juan, where the image of the Virgin was placed in front of the high altar, and a number of prayers recited. From thence they proceeded to the cathedral, where another ceremonial took place, and the Virgin finally deposited on one side of the altar, to remain for the appointed time of 9 days, and then to be conducted back to Guadalupe in great state. So I'm going to break in here just to say a little bit about this procession and ceremony that William is describing. I think he's witnessing a tradition that still goes on in Zacatecas today, and it's called the procession of La Preladita. Now, La Preladita is the little statue that William's referring to here. Now, the timings may be quite different when William's talking about it than they are today, or it may be that he was just seeing one part of this tradition, because this iconic image, which is not that big, at various times around the year gets transported from Guadalupe to Zacatecas and does a sort of tour of the churches as it goes round throughout the year. So maybe William's just observing one moment. The time when it returns back to Guadalupe convent from Zacatecas Cathedral these days is usually around Advent, but it seems to me like it must be the same ceremony that William's describing. It dates back to about 1730, I think. This figure has a lot of significance for the people in the area. She's called La Preladita, or prelate. Some people think it's linked to a period of time in Zacatecas when there was a plague, and as a sort of kind of ceremony, this image of the Virgin was taken out to, to protect the people really from disease. So I think that seems the most likely origin of it. So she's, this mother figure, protective figure for the whole population in the area. And the traditions of these things like fireworks and guns being set off still goes on today. I mean, I think it's more fireworks these days. But it's a very grand procession. I think as many as 15,000 people attend the one when she finally returns back from Zacatecas Cathedral to Guadalupe. And very colourful. And you can see pictures of the local people bearing her on their shoulders, and they're all dressed in, I suppose you'd call it, Spanish-looking 17th century attire. The actual figure is not very big at all. It's about 60 centimetres high, which, I don't know, is that how tall William describes it? I think William describes it as being a bit bigger, but anyway, as often when William describes these things, the size seems different. But I'm pretty certain he's referring to this tradition, or at least he is observing one moment of it, perhaps when it's been taken from one other church in Zacatecas to the cathedral, and this idea of it being there for 9 days and being placed there and worshipped for that amount of time and kind of resting in the cathedral is quite an important part of it. Here it says, the pilgrimage, which traces its roots back nearly 3 centuries of history, has become an event that connects generations to the faith, community and traditions that have shaped Zacatecas. In this culminating act, the faithful are welcomed by the ringing of bells and the solemn enthronement of the Virgin, a moment of great emotion and devotion until the return of next year. The origins of this tradition date back to 1704, when Fray Antonio Margil de Jesus, sorry, I can't say Spanish very well. It was in 1737, in the context of the devastating plague of Montsatzhuatl, I don't know, that's a very long word that I can't say, Matlatzhuatl, that hit Zacatecas when the tradition of moving the image was officially established. The plague, similar to typhus, claimed many lives in the city and generated a climate of great anguish and despair amongst the inhabitants. It was in this context that the Virgin of Guadalupe was requested as a sign of protection for the population. So, at the same time, the Viceroy Antonio de Vizaron declared the Virgin of Guadalupe as the principal patroness of the nation, thus consolidating her figure not only in Zacatecas but throughout Mexico. So this figure is not only important in Zacatecas but an important historical relic and image for the whole of Mexico. Anyway, I just thought I'd describe that because it seems to me that this is very much similar to what William is describing, although the timings don't seem to marry quite so much. But as I say, it could be just that he's observing one part of her journey. So that's the end of episode 50. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think there have been some interesting points of discussion there in William's adventures. I think the whole thing about money is very interesting. You know, the sort of concept of money then is very different from the one we have now, where coins in your hand were really of real intrinsic value. And now we have ways of paying via plastic card or even apps that can let you do it on your phone. You know, the idea of physical money is something that these days seems rather antiquated, doesn't it? And then stuff about William and his sword and being armed to the teeth, it seems to me, before he goes out on every journey. Anyway, and getting to know a bit about Zacatecas itself as well, which I think was good. So got a lot to digest in that episode. As ever, just to remind you again, you can contact me in those ways in which I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this episode. That's the Twitter account, Scott of the Historic, the Blue Sky account, which is Scott's Grand Tour at bsky.social, and the Facebook page as well, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. And I'm a little bit behind posting episodes there, actually, I think, so I've got to catch up and do that. But yeah, it's always good to hear from people about the podcast and who enjoy listening about this world of William and his travels and tours, and sometimes misfortunes as well in terms of his accident. So that is it. If you have been, thanks for listening.